Thanks for that, Hiram. So I'm just going to share the PowerPoint to begin with. Okay. So today I want to try to explore the connections between early modern Munster and Virginia by looking in detail at the career of the founder of Newport News, Daniel Gookin Sr., and his business partner and neighbour in South Cork, William Newce. In doing so, the presentation will explore the specific social and political context in which these two figures were moving in South Munster in the 1610s and the 1620s. In the process, this paper will also query why figures such as Gookin and Newce, who had done quite well as settlers in Munster in the 1600s and the 1610s, felt the need to diversify their interests to Virginia in the 1620s. There had always been strong links between Munster and Virginia and English colonial endeavours in North America, and particularly in Virginia. It was, after all, in Munster that Humphrey Gilbert and subsequently his half-brother Walter Raleigh had first made their names before becoming the leading figures in efforts to explore and colonise parts of the North American seaboard in the 1570s and 1580s. These connections between Munster and English colonial activity in North America and the Caribbean, particularly Virginia, continued and indeed intensified in the early 17th century. So the Munster into which Daniel Gookin Sr. would arrive in the early 1610s was shaped by the events of the 1580s. As Hiram has discussed earlier, in 1579, the 15th Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald, had rebelled against the government of Elizabeth I. He was joined by a great number of the Irish and Old English lords of Munster. Accordingly, when Desmond was eventually killed in 1583 and his allies crushed, the Crown was in a position to confiscate huge tracts of land across Munster, principally those of Desmond himself, but also those of his erstwhile allies. Elizabeth's, sorry, just to move on. So this is the Munster Plantation as it was depicted in the 1590s. This is Kilcolman Castle that's circled in the middle. This comes from the Spencer and Kilcolman website. So Elizabeth's government elected to now organise a vast state-run plantation of these areas, consisting of approximately 350,000 acres of land across the province, but primarily in Cork, West Waterford, North Kerry, and parts of southern and western Limerick. Okay, so this vast plantation area was divided into estates, generally ranging from between 4,000 and 12,000 acres of land, and distributed among several dozen English colonists or undertakers. The region in Munster with which we are concerned in southern Cork was distributed amongst a handful of major grantees. So the area in West Cork along the River Bandon was bestowed largely on Fane Beecher and Sir Richard Grenville, who received the Castle Mahon and Kinalmeaky seigneuries respectively. The town of Bandon Bridge, with which William Newce would be so closely associated, would soon emerge on these lands. Further east, to the south of Cork City, Sir Warren St. Leger, a long-standing colonist and official in South Munster, received the Cargill seigneury, including Cargill and Castle. These were some of the largest seigneuries in the plantation. Both Castle Mahon and Kinalmeaky seigneuries consisted of about 14,000 acres each. However, they were eclipsed by the estate granted to Walter Raleigh to the east. Raleigh received a vast stretch of land, encompassing the entirety of East Cork around Youghal and into West Waterford around the towns of Lismore and Tallow. So Hiram has explored the plantation and reactions to it in detail. In brief, a decade of British settlement followed, and the plantation was beginning to prosper when, in 1598, it was overthrown as the 9 Years' War was extended into the south of Ireland. Thus, when British settlement recommenced in the aftermath of the 9 Years' War, it began what is sometimes referred to as the Second Munster Plantation. The legal titles which had been established at the inception of the plantation in the mid-1580s remained firm in law, though by now estates were either passing to the sons of the original grantees or were being sold off to newcomers. So this in brief is how the Munster plantation was developing in southern Munster up to the early 1600s. Its future in this region thereafter must be viewed through the prism of one man, Richard Boyle, so a social upstart from Kent, who subsequently rose to become the first Earl of Cork in 1620. Boyle had arrived in Ireland in 1588, possibly fleeing charges of forgery and other misdemeanours he had committed in both his native Kent and while working in the Treasury offices in London. He quickly set to embezzling money in Ireland, and by the mid-1590s was illegally acquiring extensive properties in Connaught and in Munster. He was imprisoned and questioned by the government on at least a half a dozen occasions in the late 1590s as a result of this activity, but perennially avoided any thorough prosecution. Then, between 1600 and 1603, he obtained a position in the inner circle of the senior military commander in Munster, Sir George Carew, a position which Boyle used to siphon off staggering levels of the Crown's funds for the armed forces in Munster for his own use. It was these illicitly obtained funds with which Boyle in 1602 purchased the Munster plantation estate of Sir Walter Raleigh for a knockdown price of £1,500. Thus, on the eve of the accession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England and Ireland, Boyle came into possession of a 42,000-acre estate across East Cork and West Waterford. The upstart spent the next several years developing his lands around Lismore and Youghal and accumulating vast sums from his rents on these lands. This money would soon be put to use acquiring lands further to the west, activities which would bring him into contact with William Newce and Daniel Gookin Sr. Okay. So we'll return to Boyle shortly, but I want to backtrack to explore the early careers of Newce and Gookin. William Newce's background is largely unclear. He first appears as a military captain in Munster at the height of the 9 Years' War in the late 1590s. By early 1601, he had leased some lands on Raleigh's estates at Inchiquin in East Cork. He fought at the Siege of Kinsale in the dying days of 1601, but within months his position in West Waterford was undermined. Following Boyle's acquisition of the Raleigh estate, Newce appears to have been pushed out of Inchiquin. Boyle had built up extensive alliances with a broad range of English military officers in Munster in the 1590s and early 1600s. Individuals such as Lieutenant John Downing, Captain John Strongman, and Ensign Hugh Croker. Following his acquisition of Raleigh's estate, he now began leasing some of the key properties in East Cork and West Waterford to these men, who would oversee local military militias there for Boyle in the post-war period. Newce was not included amongst these, and he was effectively pushed out of Boyle's area of control. As a result, he moved west, and by 1604, he was leasing a portion of the Grenville Signory in Carberry in West Cork. In the years ahead, a settlement emerged here, the village of Newcestown, which has survived down to the present day. More significantly, in the next 10 years or so, down to the mid-1610s, Newce began developing an association with John Archdeacon, a second settlement about 10 kilometres from Newcestown on the banks of the River Bandon. This was to become known as Bandon Bridge. So here it is in terms of its actual location in West Cork. Newcestown, obviously here is slightly to the northwest, but you get a sense of Newce's general geographical area of activity. By the early 1610s, Bandon Bridge had grown to a town of at least 40 houses. It was incorporated in 1613 and Newce served as the first provost of the town. Hence, by the mid-1610s, Newce had overseen the establishment of two significant settlements in the Carberry region, Newcestown and the thriving town of Bandon Bridge, which was quickly becoming one of the most important new settlements to emerge in Munster as a result of the plantation. It was into this environment that Gookin would arrive in the early 1610s. Unlike Newce, we know a considerable amount about the early life of Daniel Gookin Sr. He was born in 1582. The Gookins were an affluent yeomanry family which hailed from Beaksbourne, about 3 kilometres to the southeast of Canterbury in Kent. Curiously enough, this means that Daniel Gookin's family members might well have been familiar with the Boyle family, who also hailed from not far from Canterbury. This was not entirely uncommon, and much of the British settlers arriving to Ireland in the late 16th and early 17th century often came from specific parts of England. Boyle's estates in the early 17th century were a melting pot in which a disproportionately large number of Kentish people settled. The Gookins are symptomatic of how this occurred. Daniel's older brother Vincent had left Kent for Ireland in 1606 and established himself at Court McSherry, not too far to the south of Newce's emerging settlements at Newcestown and Bandon Bridge on the south coast of Cork near Kinsale. Here he was involved in the pilchard fishery and perhaps the piracy, which has recently been explored in depth by Connie. Evidently, Vincent prospered, and by the early 1610s, his younger brother was drawn to join him. Daniel immigrated to South Munster from Kent, either in 1611 or 1612, and settled just across the bay from Vincent at Coolmaine. However, his main associations lie with Carrigaline. So here we have Cargill and Castle, as Eamon has discussed earlier. In March 1613, Thomas Petley had acquired the castle from the St. Leger family. This, however, was a short-lived acquisition, and at some stage in 1616, Daniel Gookin purchased Carrigaline from Petley in a deal which involved the swapping of some lands at Ripple on the suburbs of Canterbury back in Kent. As such, Petley may also have been from Kent originally, as indeed were the St. Ledgers. So by 1616, Gookin had set himself up with a nice medieval castle not too far from Cork City. Eamon, Hiram and others have spoken about Carrigaline, but I'll just add slightly more from a relatively obscure source. We have a rental extant for the Carrigaline estate under Gookin's patronage. So this is taken from a patent book amongst the Cork papers at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. This indicates that there is a substantial level of settlement at Carrigaline Castle and the surrounding area. Gookin and his family resided at the castle itself, but there were many others nearby. A Reynold Hinton held 80 acres of land and the rights to the fisheries of the River Owen spilling out into Cork Harbour. A Robert Colson had the lease of 5 acres near the castle and the mills there. Many other tenants with English surnames like Hammond, Burton, Wood, Sharp and Jenkins were leasing houses without extensive acreage other than a garden, usually for about £1 to £2 per annum. But this was not an exclusively English or British colony. A Maurice O'Flynn was leasing a tenement and 2 gardens from Gookin, and a William O'Keefe and Dennis O'Corrigan were also renting a house or cabin each. 3 further unnamed Irish tenants were leasing cabins and gardens, which formed part of the castle ploughland, and these were consequently some of Gookin's closest neighbours. Significantly, not all were paying their rents in cash. The 3 unnamed Irish tenants were, for example, leasing their cabins and garden plots in return for 40 days' labour each year. Similarly, John Warren and Charles Jenkins had the option of paying £20 for a substantial plot of land they were leasing, or 60 barrels of corn and wheat in lieu thereof. What Gookin's rental also suggests is that land in South Cork, even prime land near Cork City, was readily available during the early Stuart period. Gookin noted that he had been trying to lease a 60-acre plot of land on the estate for a considerable period of time, and had even offered it on a year-to-year basis without any long-term commitment, but it was still unoccupied. As such, the Gookin rental reveals much about the nature of British plantation society in Munster in the early 17th century. This was a hybrid society in which the newcomers on paper would prioritise the idea of erecting British or English colonies, but which in reality had British settlers living side by side and engaging freely in economic and social interchange with the Irish. The rental indicates that in total Gookin might have expected to receive an income of well over £300 from the leasing of his lands of Carrigaline. All seemed to be going well for him and for other settlers like Newce, just to the west of Bandon Bridge in Newcestown. But this was about to change. In the autumn of 1617, Gookin became involved in a dispute with Boyle over some lands adjoining his own. The future Earl of Cork had begun expanding his interests from his base in East Cork and West Waterford in the mid-1610s. So this is just a rough approximate map of the Boyle estate by the late 1620s, but the red is effectively what Boyle had possession of by about 1613, 1614. And then these green areas are lands that he acquired over the next decade up to about 1626, 27. In particular, Boyle was expanding into west and southwest Cork in the River Bandon Valley. Accordingly, from 1613 onwards, he had begun leasing properties around Bandon Bridge, putting pressure on Newce and his partner Archdeacon. Now in late 1617, Gookin came under the same pressure. Boyle was an extremely aggressive land magnate, and when he entered a particular area, he attempted to buy up everything he could. Gookin saw the writing on the wall early, and by the spring of 1618, he had sold Carrigaline to Boyle. However, he remained in residence there and was immediately leased back the estate as the chief tenant. The following year, Boyle also seized Bandon Bridge. On the 2nd of May 1619, he purchased the entire town and surrounding region from Henry Beecher, the son of the original grantee and the man from whom Newce and Archdeacon had originally leased the lands on which they had established the town. Hence, right at the end of the 1610s, William Newce and Daniel Gookin found their positions in South and Southwest Cork undermined by Boyle's expansion into the area, though they remained as tenants in their respective locales. This inadvertently would have significant implications for the emerging English colony at Virginia. So we wouldn't be having this webinar today if things had not developed in this manner. Effectively, what was driving figures like Gookin and Newce to look across the Atlantic was the pursuit of economic and social opportunity. It was this quest for opportunity which was driving so much of early modern colonization at this time. A key point to which I believe Nicholas will speak shortly in his keynote. But there was one more ingredient in this particular instance. Just as Newce and Gookin were losing control over Bandon Bridge and Carrigaline, the government of James I was also considering the introduction of a prohibition on the importation of cattle from Ireland into England. The Irish Cattle Bill was designed to protect the English livestock trade from Irish competition. When introduced in 1621, it would eventually come to nothing, but the spectre of it must have been considerable in 1620, particularly for planters who dealt in livestock like Newce and Gookin. So this point was made by Audrey Horning in one of her recent articles. It is hardly coincidental then that with the English market about to be closed to their Irish cattle, Newce and Gookin, who had evidently become acquaintances during the 1610s, partnered up together in an enterprise to transport settlers and cattle to the burgeoning colony in Virginia. English overseas settlement and trade was booming in the late 1610s and early 1620s. Where Raleigh and others had made tentative and abortive efforts to settle around Virginia and North Carolina, the exploitation of tobacco in Virginia and sugar in the Caribbean had seen an explosion of activity in the 1610s, and efforts were being made to set up colonies on many small Caribbean islands and parts of the North American coast. Newce and Gookin now entered into this business, and they were not the only individuals to do so from the colonial milieu of early Stuart Munster. In 1620, one Thomas Wood had signed an agreement with the Virginia Company, the London-based joint stock company charged with oversight of the colonization of the broad Virginia colony, to transport cattle to Virginia at £11 per cow. Newce was involved in this and had committed to transporting 1,000 settlers by 1625 to the colony, which was starved of labour to work the tobacco fields there. Incidentally, the primary reason why the first shipload of African slaves had arrived at Virginia in 1619. Pursuant from the Wood-Newce agreement, Gookin, probably on advice from Newce, came to a similar agreement with the Virginia Company in June 1621. Gookin set sail for America on the Flying Heart in the autumn of 1621. Weeks earlier, Newce had left for Virginia himself, but when he arrived at Jamestown, so here we have the rough approximate location of it, or of it and Newport News in the Chesapeake Bay. But when Newce arrived at Jamestown in October, he died within days. Thus, when Gookin arrived on the Flying Heart on 22 November with 150 passengers on board, he learned that his business partner was dead. It has previously been suggested that when Gookin elected to establish his own settlement further out towards the Atlantic than Jamestown, towards Chesapeake Bay on the Virginia Peninsula, he named it after his recently deceased partner. However, as Luke will cover in his paper in a minute, the name Newport News predates the arrival of Newce and Gookin in Virginia by several years, and it is more likely that Newport News is named for Christopher Newport, one of the early founders of the Jamestown colony. Whatever the etymology of the colony's name, which Gookin actually named Mary's Mount after his wife, Mary's Mount at Newport News, it was quickly under threat. In March 1622, a massive uprising amongst the local Indians attacked and overthrew much of the fledgling British settlements in the region, as Sherry has explored in some depth earlier. Newport News successfully resisted the massacre. Gookin was soon departing, though, thereafter. In April, just weeks after the massacre, he left Virginia and was the first to deliver word of the attack back to England. It is quite possible that Daniel Gookin Sr. never returned to Virginia. He certainly dispatched a second ship of settlers and cattle from Ireland in 1623, incidentally captained by John Clark, who had piloted the Mayflower in its voyage to New England in 1620. This second trip, however, proved far less profitable than the 1621 voyage, as Gookin was being paid in tobacco and the market price had started to plummet as the 1620s went on, as more tobacco farms were established across Virginia. Consequently, Gookin seems to have abandoned further efforts to provision Virginia, though the colony of Mary's Mount at Newport News survived, generally composed of young men in their 20s who had limited opportunities at home and who had undertaken the perilous act of resettlement in North America. Mary's Mount was managed for the Gookins in the 1620s by two agents, a Welshman, Richard Griffin, between 1621 and 1626, following which Thomas Addison took up the role. Thereafter, the colony appears to have been managed by Gookin's son and namesake Daniel Jr., the subject of Luke's paper in a minute. Daniel Sr.'s later years were seemingly spent in Ireland. There is little evidence for his movements, but he was clearly in an increasingly precarious international financial position, his New World exploits having failed to generate the profits he had hoped for. As a result, in the summer of 1629, he surrendered the remainder of the lease he had on Cargill to Boyle. So here we have a copy of the Articles of Agreement that transferred the property. Just weeks later, the Earl leased it to Thomas Daunt, fully sundering Gookin's ties of 13 years with Carrigaline. In one final effort to achieve riches in the New World, in February 1631, Daniel petitioned King Charles I for a grant of the mythical St. Brendan's Isle, said to lie in the North Atlantic between Ireland and Newfoundland. This was received favourably, and Gookin obtained a crown grant of the same if he could locate it. It is unlikely, though, that he ever made any effort. He appears to have spent his final years at Cork City, as when he died in the spring of 1633, he was described as being of Red Abbey in the parish of St. Finbarrs. So ended the admittedly mixed career of the founder of Newport News. So, to sum up, this paper should hopefully have served to provide some detail on the political, social, and economic circumstances in which would-be colonists who first settled in early 17th century Munster and then developed an interest in Virginia were operating. The early years of the reign of James I in the 1600s and 1610s presented many opportunities for ambitious adventurers such as William Newce and Daniel Gookin Sr. to settle in and thrive in South Munster, as the plantation was rebuilt in the aftermath of the 9 Years' War. By the mid-1610s, Newce had elected 2 colonies at Bantam Bridge and Newcestown, while Gookin and his brother Vincent were involved in a cohort of individuals profiting from the Atlantic fisheries around Kinsale and Baltimore, activity from which Gookin was able to generate enough finance to purchase an estate at Cargiline. But trouble was afoot in the shape of Richard Boyle, the soon-to-be first Earl of Cork. As Boyle expanded his landed interests from West Waterford and East Cork westwards into Western and Southern Cork in the 1610s, smaller colonial entrepreneurs such as Newce and Gookin were gradually forced out of the region or had their positions substantially undermined by the grasping Earl. As they did, many looked for new theatres into which to move their operations, as English colonial activity in North America and the Caribbean boomed in the 1610s and 1620s, largely on the back of the huge profits ensuing from cultivation of the new cash crops, tobacco and sugar. It was these impulses which led figures such as Newce and Gookin to diversify their interest across the Atlantic to areas such as Virginia. The results, though mixed for these 2 individuals, more broadly were highly significant for the overall development of England and Britain's overseas colonies in the 17th century. Thank you.
Luke did his PhD at Boston University about the colonial venture of Daniel Gookin, both in County Cork and also in Virginia. Luke has also worked as an archaeologist searching for the lost colony at Roanoke. He was more recently working at Mount Vernon in Washington, D.C., and published a book, The Stewards of Memory, The Past, Present, and Future of Historic Preservation at George Washington's Mount Vernon, along with Carl Cadeau and Thomas Reinhardt. And I remember with great, it was a great memory of his visit with the lady donors of Mount Vernon to County Cork, and in particular to Lismore Castle. That was great fun, that event altogether. And Luke is now in Virginia, as I say, at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, and is really the right man to tell us more about Daniel Gookin. Look, I can't see your
Okay,
presentation.
let me go ahead and try this. I'm going to stop sharing and then try it again.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. There we go. All right. Can you see the share now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Hiram. I don't know if you give me too much credit there. I hope I'm the right man for the job to go ahead and situate Daniel Gookin, Senior, Junior, and the Newce brothers on the Virginia landscape. But to those of you who are listening to this presentation in North America and Ireland, good afternoon and good evening. And today I'm broadcasting to you from the Jamestown Settlement Museum, which is situated on the landscape of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom's territory of Senecomica, which in the Algonquian language means the land between two waters within the district of Paspahegh. English colonists settled on indigenous land not far from here on Jamestown Island, displacing the Paspahegh by 1611. And today we acknowledge their presence on the landscape, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence here, because this is very much a presentation about colonialism and how we grapple with that, in the modern day, and moving ahead and thinking about a commemoration and what that might look like. So we've gotten a lot of good information to kind of tee up the presentation that I'm about to give from Hiram and Eamon and the Irish context, with Hank Letton's early presentation to give you an idea about the grounding on the landscape, and then Dr. Sherry Shuck Hall's introduction to the indigenous population of Virginia. And David's presentation was fantastic because now I don't have to spend as much time in Ireland talking about the plantation landscape there, and we can launch right into Virginia. And I'm going to take you to Maryland very briefly, and then also to Massachusetts. So after 1607, the way I like to see Daniel Gookin Sr., Thomas and Sir William Newce, and then Gookin Sr.'s sons, Daniel Jr. and John, they're almost the second wave of colonizers who come to Virginia by way of Ireland when the Virginia Company is on its last legs and we're getting ready to transition to a royal colony and what that might look like. So I hope to be able to better situate these actors on the colonial landscape of Virginia and solidify these really great tangible relationships that we have between English colonial projects in Ireland and Virginia, and how this shaped the mindset of these folks that were traveling transatlantically back and forth, and how we got to where we are today. So how indeed do we do that? I think as many of these papers in this webinar have suggested, it's very difficult to rely on one data set alone. And drawing from information that I gathered from my doctoral dissertation that was completed in 2015, the best way that I found to do this, to situate the Gookin family in Virginia, in Ireland, and then beyond, was through the three basic concepts of providing the archaeological biography of the family, getting into the weeds with microhistories, and then looking at comparative colonial projects, all through the lens of what is referred to as multi-sited archaeology. And there on this screen below, I've kind of charted out the pathway of the road that I took, and there were a lot of dead ends, a lot of twists and turns, cul-de-sacs, what have you, to be able to get at this larger story that I think really makes a lot of good sense when you look at both Newport News and Ireland in this colonial context. So throughout the slideshow that I'm going to be showing you, you'll see on the top and the bottom of some of these slides, following the people, following the things, following the metaphors, the story, the life, the biography, and the conflict of how we kind of go about piecing all of this together. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've got to introduce a little bit about Ireland first, although many of the previous presentations have done a great job of situating the Gookin family on the landscape. But here again, just to remind you, you see on the locator map, you've got the cities of Cork, the town of Carrigaline, Newcestown, Bandon, Kinsale, Courtmacsherry, all of these place names that are going to be important to the Newce and Gookin families when they ultimately wind up in Virginia. And simply because Eamon's presentation did not have the slides, I wanted to show a couple of the images that I took in 2011 of the 17th century build at Carrigaline and Castle. You see in the inset box, and I'm waving my cursor over it, that's the way that Carrigaline is depicted in the 1572 single drought of monster map. And then taking it one slide further, these are a couple images that I just quickly cut and pasted from dissertation text of what survives of that 17th century build at Carrigaline Castle. So you can see the kind of dire shape that it's in, rapidly being overtaken by vegetation. And there again, this photo was taken 9 years ago, so hopefully more of it's still there, and Eamon can probably speak to that a little bit better. And then another drawing that we've got right here comes from the Downs survey in 1655, and this is a cutout of the depiction of what Carrigaline Castle looked like during that period. So there again, this is after the property is solidly within the hands of the Boyle family, but you get that contrast between 1572, 1655, and those improvements to the landscape that Eamon alluded to in his earlier presentation. So,
look, could you go on to slideshow? It's just that your images in the presentation are coming in and out, sort of.
Sure.
It might help.
Yeah.
Okay. How's that?
I hit from. There you go.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. All right. As long as you can see that now, that's perfect, and I'll continue rolling on here. But just please do stop me if it goes away again. So there, again, the ruins of the 17th century build at Carrigaline Castle and the Downs survey image. So moving ahead to Virginia, what does the landscape look like? Sherry's presentation had a map of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom as it looked in 1607. This is the landscape that the Gookin and Newce families squarely found themselves within. And you can see that white inset box on the map. That's the lower peninsula, and you can make out the words Kecoughtan and Nansemond. These are the two tributary tribes of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom that would have occupied the landscape that the Newces and the Gookins settled within when they arrived in Virginia. Prior to their arrival, the Kecoughtan had been eliminated and dispersed by July of 1610 by Sir Thomas Gates and Lord Delaware and Jamestown settlers. And the Kecoughtan were a much smaller tributary tribe. They were able to field about 30 warriors, and the property that they occupied was well known for, as Hank Lutton alluded to, strawberry fields, cornfields. It was already cleared for agriculture, so it was a really fantastic spot for early patentees to find themselves within, but it still had that element of danger. I don't think anybody was really quite worried about being executed by sledgehammer in this area, but nonetheless, quite a nasty spot to be in those early heady days of the Virginia Company. And the Nansemond tribe on the south side of the James River was to bedevil the English settlers from 1607 until they ultimately were coerced into peace in 1646. As you can see, they were able to field 200 warriors by John Smith's account in 1607. So almost from the outset, the Nansemonds are at war with the English settlers. As early as 1607, Christopher Newport is in the area with an exploratory expedition from Jamestown, where he is, quote, met with a torrent of arrows at the mouth of the Nansemond River, and he and his crew retaliate by destroying corn and burning canoes. In the winter of 1609, when the starving time period occurs with the Jamestown settlement, and food is particularly scarce, settlers under the command of Captain John Martin and Sir George Percy attempt to take corn by force from the Nansemond with approximately 100 men. And this ends up in an abysmal English defeat with 50 men slain, corn stuffed into the mouths of the corpses, and it's a pretty clear message from the Nansemond to stay away. Now, moving ahead towards the period when the Virginia Company is beginning to dissolve and we get the Newce family and the Gookin family on the scene, by the opening decade, investment is what the Virginia Company needs. So as David pointed out in his earlier presentation, Newce and Gookin Sr. both get involved in the Virginia Company for provisioning. Now, I want to do a little bit of myth busting here, so to speak. The map that you see here rendered in this computer graphic is from 1958, before the city of Newport News was amalgamated with the old county of Warwick, and Hampton was amalgamated with the old county of Elizabeth City. Now, the place name Newport News predates the arrival of the Newce family by several years. So I think we can unequivocally say that this place name Newport News does not have anything to do with the Newce family, but more than likely Christopher Newport. That does not, however, diminish what we can say is probably the seminal founding era of Newport News and even Hampton, going back to the Newce family and the Gookin family. But I want to be very clear. Newport News was already an established place name before the Newces show up. So it's not Newport News. Newport News likely relates to Captain Christopher Newport. So thinking about these settlements and where they're situated on the landscape, if we look at letter A, this is the land that Thomas Newce is granted when he seats first in Elizabeth City by April of 1620. He gets a rather lucrative position through the Virginia Company, where he's named the deputy for Virginia Company land, and he's responsible for 50 tenants. He's given the rank of captain, likely due to military experience that he may have had before, or with some of the Virginia adventurers, simply because they've got some cash and they're able to bring tenants under control. They're given military rank in the militia. And his brother William Newce arrives soon after. But as we know from the historical documentation, as you heard in earlier presentations, William Newce really isn't a driving force within the Virginia colony, although had he survived, he would have been given the title Marshal of Virginia if he was able to bring 1,000 settlers over from Ireland. And it's likely that he would have had a more significant role in the development of the colony, but he perishes shortly after arrival. So again, this plantation that Newce settles, because of where it's located, it's very likely fortified. We'll get into that a little bit later in this presentation of why we probably think that that's the case. But by 1621, by the end of the year, he's reported to have had a great corn crop and an excellent harvest. So he's well established down in this area of Elizabeth City. Now, arriving a little bit later in November of 1621, you can see letter B right below the place name Newport News, where Daniel Gookin Sr. ends up planting 1,300 acres to become the Mary's Mount Plantation. This is an excellent location. There's a freshwater spring. You're right at the mouth of the James River, so any incoming and outgoing ships are going to have to call on the property. Also, it's a deep water anchorage, unlike Jamestown Island. And then you see a little bit further up the river, if you can follow my cursor, this piece of land that sticks out. This is called Mulberry Island, and there's also other English settlements located there too. The plantation that Daniel Gookin Sr. operates, it's not kind of squared off with meets and bounds like plantation. It's a narrow strip of land that's approximately 1 mile long, just going right up the coast. So there again, very advantageous for trade and for provisioning. And it's referred to in the historical record after Gookin and his crew arrive on the Flying Heart and get set up as the Irish Plantation by Governor Francis Wyatt. And again, like the Newce Plantation, it's highly likely this is fortified. Now, we're going to go back and have a look at one of these Debray engravings that has been alluded to in several of the presentations beforehand. This event, for better or worse, historically has been referred to as a Virginia Indian uprising. I think that we can best characterize this as an assault on the English settlements, because at this time, the Native American population, the Virginia Indian Powhatan chiefdom, is much more numerous than the English colonial settlements up and down the waterways. And they certainly did not view themselves as the minority at this point, but attempted to stamp out any deep-rooted settlements that might take place. And as you've heard in earlier presentations, this assault on Virginia took place on March 22nd, 1622, resulting in 347 settlers killed. That's 1/3 of the colonial population. Gookin's plantation and Newce's plantation are both particularly hard hit. They suffer losses, but the important takeaway is that these settlements are not abandoned like so many of the other Virginia settlements, where the planters who do survive flee back to Jamestown and to that nucleus, and that early outward expansion is lost, and it takes several years to build back. So to the credit of both Newce and Gookin, they do manage to hang on. Shortly after this event, Daniel Gookin Sr. returns to Ireland to resupply his settlement. And in 1623, when the Providence arrives with the resupply, and as David accurately points out, it's rather nebulous as to whether Daniel Gookin Sr. comes back in 1623. It's reported that there are only 8 of the original group of 50 alive. The Newce plantation didn't survive much better. They were reported to have taken on settlers from the attacked outlying settlements, and Thomas Newce himself perishes in June of 1622, and it's reported that only 3 of the 50 that were seated on his property were left alive too. So the Gookin resupply really kind of regalvanizes his plantation at Mary's Mount with 40 new settlers and 50 referred to as Irish cows. But by the muster taken in Virginia in 1624-25, it is reported that there are 18 men, 2 women, and these all of these individuals came from the 1621 and 1623 venture. So while that's not a really great rate of survival, it's far superior to other numbers that we see throughout Virginia during this time period. So I think that stick-to-itiveness and being able to hold on certainly suggests that there was fortification that took place on both plantations. So as I mentioned earlier, you have to draw on multiple lines of evidence to really get at the Gookin and Newce stories and the Irish attributes that you find within Newport News and Ireland. Unfortunately, archaeology is not something that we'll be able to deploy to be able to look for the Mary's Mount plantation, because as Hank Lutton points out, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad also found the area where Gookin settled to be highly attractive. And this is a photo taken in 2012 of the coal docks that are there. What we know archaeologically of the Mary's Mount plantation is from a singular refuse pit that was eroding into the James River. It was salvaged in 1911 by Jerome Knowles, which now is in the Colonial Williamsburg Archaeological Collection. So there's some compelling evidence there, but sadly, we need to look elsewhere to find tangible evidence of these solid Irish connections on the landscape. But don't despair, because fortunately we can. Though Daniel Gookin Sr. himself perishes without setting foot back in Virginia in 1633, and he's fiscally unstable, he's land rich in the colony of Virginia. He was owed acreage for the 1623 voyage that he undertook, and also he was owed a little bit more for not abandoning his patent in 1622. So this conveys to his 2 sons, Daniel Jr. and John Gookin, who both appear to have been in Virginia by, at the very least, 1631. So on the map, you can see the red triangle. That indicates the location of the Mary's Mount plantation, which the family holds on to for a period of time. And if you remember from David's presentation, he mentions that it's under the care of 2 overseers, one of whom is Thomas Addison, and he's going to appear in just a little bit. The Nansemond plantation that I'll talk about, that is known from archaeology, is likely influenced in design and construction by Daniel Gookin Jr. And then John Gookin marries into a very advantageously great relationship for him into the ancient planter family of Adam Thorogood. He marries Adam Thorogood's widow, Sarah Offaly, and Thorogood has managed to amass thousands of acres by the time he perishes in 1634. So John Gookin inherits approximately 6,840 acres with at least 13 white tenant families down in what is now modern-day Virginia Beach, and 7 enslaved Africans. And John attains the rank of Burgess, so he's represented in the Virginia Assembly, and he's a militia commander until his death in 1643. So the Gookin family is doing quite well for themselves, the sons of Daniel Sr., by the 1630s, when they patent their own land in Virginia. So thinking more about those Irish connections and those tangible links, Daniel Gookin Jr. patents 1,500 acres And you can see that located right here where the cursor is with his name. This is the James River. Almost directly across from this point where Gookin gets his patent is the Mary's Mount Plantation. So this is right in the heartland of the Nansemond Indian tribe. So that's another important key factor to remember here. This is still hostile landscape, but if you're willing to take the risk, you can get a larger land patent if you agree to settle in this area. Thinking about some of the others that ended up coming over with the Mary's Mount contingent in 1621 and 1623, you see Thomas Addison has a small plantation. He was Gookin's overseer at Mary's Mount, just below Daniel Jr.'s property. But then there are also two other individuals of note who settle on the other side of the Nansemond River. John Parrott has 2 tracts, and George White has 1. Now, the important thing about George White and John Parrott is that George White shows up in the rent rolls as a lessee in Bandon Bridge in 1608, and John Parrott as a lessee in Newcestown in 1619. I was able to find those 2 references, but I didn't find anything that post-dated both of those dates. So 1608, 1619, it does seem clear to me that it's likely that these 2 individuals were also in Ireland and ended up coming over with Daniel Gookin, so might have shared that same kind of colonizing ethos. So the Nansemond Fort archaeological site is located on land belonging to Michael Wilcox, and with Daniel Gookin Jr. and John both being captains of the Upper Norfolk Militia, that's Daniel, and the Lower Norfolk Militia, that's John, it's highly likely that they understood the value of putting up a strong palisade to be able to better fortify. So there again, another tangible link to what's going on in County Cork at the time. When I went over to do my doctoral dissertation research, I visited a number of fortified sites, and these 3 that I show are just illustrations from kind of a long range of time in the area that would have been known to Daniel Gookin Jr. and the Newces. And some of these properties should be familiar to you already from David's paper. That's Shippool Castle, Poliani, and then Moss Grove is the one that's listed with its number 9. And then this is Ballyannon. This is a later fortified house. But you can see the rounded bastions, the fortification, as being something similar to that we see in Virginia. So while there's not quite a one-to-one comparison, it's definitely that fortified landscape that I think gets brought over and makes the Gookin family and the Newce family success stories as they're able to hold on in the wake of these Virginia Indian attacks. So the archaeological site known as the Nansemond Fort that does bring in all these elements, you can see it in that conceptual drawing, was likely palisaded sometime around 1641 when tensions with the Nansemond Indians really start to heat up again. And that's likely the catalyst for palisading, and Daniel Jr. would have been responsible for organizing the militia to fortify themselves. In 1641, we find a reference from Lower Norfolk that Captain John Gookin hath represented to the board certain outrages and robberies committed by the Indians belonging to Nansemond in the county of Lower Norfolk, and the court hath therefore ordered to the request of the said Captain John Gookin that authority be given to the commander of the Upper Norfolk Militia, so that's Daniel Gookin, by commission to send to the Indian King of Nansemond that those Indians who have committed outrages may be sent in to receive such punishment as the nature of the offense may justly merit, and also to restore the goods stolen, which if they shall refuse, they shall be put to the sword. So that's a pretty stark order that Daniel is given, and the account comes from John Gookin. So you can see the 2 brothers working in tandem to be able to keep the Virginia Indian population in check. And it certainly is representative of a time when things are coming to a head with Daniel Gookin Jr., and he makes the decision to leave Virginia. So it's not clear whether this is because of the hostilities that are breaking out, but we know from the historical accounts that Daniel Jr. Becomes an ardent Puritan. It's not clear if this comes from Daniel Gookin Sr., who upon his demise, when his inventory is probated, he has what are referred to as several Puritan tracts. So it's not known if it's learned from the father, but Daniel Jr. certainly picks it up. So he makes the decision to leave Virginia. This occurs right after his brother John's death in 1643 and right before the second Indian attack spearheaded by the Nansemons in a protracted war from 1644 to 1646. So Daniel Jr. leaves for a brief period of time, settles up in what is now close to present-day Annapolis, Maryland, where there's a large Puritan contingent already, patents a sizable property, leaves it under the care of an enslaved African family, and then he moves up to Boston, Massachusetts in 1644, and he is up there until his death in 1687, but still retains his Virginia and Maryland properties for a period of time. So I just want to point out here that this is an interesting kind of paradox that you get with the Virginia adventure for Daniel Gookin Jr. In Virginia, he's known to be an ardent Indian fighter, and he's sometimes known as a trader with the Virginia Indians and other native groups, learning the Algonquian language, but he's very critical of the Virginia Indian policy. He's visited by Dutch mariner David Peters de Vries in 1633, and in a literal translation of de Vries' narrative, when de Vries is talking to Daniel Gookin Jr. about the Virginia Indian population, Gookin is said to remark, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." I don't know how that really translates from ancient High Dutch, but that's what we have. So that's really interesting in stark contrast when he moves to New England, where he does retain the enslaved family from Maryland. He moves them up with him to his Cambridge home. But then he ends up becoming this champion of converting New England Indians to Christianity, which he definitely doesn't seem to have any kind of concept of doing when he's in Virginia. So something that I think is an interesting takeaway from this colonial experience. I want to throw this out there too. While it remains to be further explored, it's worth noting that Robert Boyle, who you see pictured here in the portrait, who is the seventh son of Richard Boyle, great Earl of Cork, who we've heard so much about. Robert Boyle ends up being appointed to the governorship of the Corporation for the Propagating of the Gospel Among the Indians in New England, also known as the New England Company for short. And he's also a member of the Crown Council for Foreign Plantations. So Boyle begins to become involved with Daniel Gookin and the Reverend John Eliot. John Eliot sets up a missionizing effort in New England known as the Praying Towns, and Daniel Gookin supports him, and Robert Boyle does likewise too. So I think this is really interesting in the context of some of these other presentations that we had, thinking back to Catherine Bond's paper about Gookin Jr. writing his narrative of the New England Indians as the Indians aren't wearing their traditional clothing anymore. They're wearing English clothing. Archaeology done on some of these praying town sites certainly does suggest more influxes of European goods, and whether they're outfitted in a standard way or not remains to be seen. But I think this is a really interesting other Irish connection to further explore, and also part of this whole colonial context and the back and forth. So moving ahead, so we have some time for questions. Daniel Gookin Jr. situates himself in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He holds a lucrative government post, oversees the Praying Town Indians. In 1675, things come to a head in New England where there is an assault by several of the Confederated New England Indian tribes on the English settlements in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and in portions of what is now Maine and also New Hampshire. This is known as Metacomet or King Philip's War. And during this period, Gookin gets himself into hot water, and you really start to see evidence of othering taking place. Gookin advocates for the arming of Praying Town Indians. This doesn't go over well with the colonial government. There's a direct quote from February of 1675 when several English settlements have been burnt out that referred to Gookin as a traitor to his king and country. And handbills are passed around through Boston, where the bill states, "As Christians, we warn Gookin to prepare for death, for though he will deservedly die, they wish him the health of his soul." So rather interesting there. And then later in that year, we have another court deposition where a Richard Scott comes into a tavern, and suddenly after he comes in, he breaks out into hideous railing expressions against the worshipful Captain Daniel Gookin, calling him an Irish dog, that he was never faithful to his country, the son of a whore, a bitch, a rogue. God confound him and God rot his soul. If I could meet him alone, I would pistol him. I wish my knife and sizers were in his heart. He is the devil's interpreter. I and 2 or 3 more designed to cut off all Gookin's brethren at the island, meaning Boston, but some English dog discovered it, and the devil will plague him. So I think it's interesting that the Irish epithet gets brought out when it's determined that Daniel Gookin is not a loyal English subject. So there, again, something more to discover there. However, by the war's end in 1677, Daniel Gookin's reputation is restored, and he continues to advocate for the New England Indian population. And just to kind of end this presentation and think more about how we should think about commemorating these Irish influences in the founding of European settlements in Newport News and in Ireland itself, and the impact on the colonial period, I think we need to look at the fact that these successive colonizing projects give the Gookin family a different outlook on how to approach settlement in North America. And it's that back and forth lessons learned in Ireland versus lessons learned in Virginia, and contacts that the family members appear to have, which is a different paper for a different time, back and forth when Daniel Jr. is in Massachusetts and Virginia, and his cousins, the sons of Sir Vincent Gookin, are also kind of going down these parallel paths of policy in Ireland too. And then this whole idea of the concept of othering. Thinking of Daniel Gookin as being Irish, when I think Hiram accurately points out he's New English, he's not Gaelic Irish, and the shifting identities there and when those get trotted out. And then also with the Virginia Indian and indigenous populations, and then also what you see in Ireland too, what are the lessons learned there as well. So I think in this period, while we're still kind of grappling with what colonization means in both Newport News and the colonizing projects in Ireland, for better or worse, what do we each have to contribute to this dialogue on both sides of the Atlantic when we get brought into the larger discussions and the narratives of 18th and 19th century migrations to the United States from Ireland. So we'll leave it at that. And it's been wonderful to be a part of this presentation. Thank you, Hiram and David, for organizing, and hopefully there'll be some questions here and we can take this a little bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. That was and lots of food for thought there about Daniel Senior and Daniel Junior. So is there any questions for either David or Luke? James, can you ask a question there?
Yes, thanks, Hiram. A question there for Luke. Do we have any idea of the sort of fortifications that Daniel Gookin Jr. himself actually would have constructed in either Virginia or Massachusetts?
Sure. We actually do have a little bit of evidence on the Virginia side, although it remains, unfortunately, an archaeological gray literature on that tract of land that I showed jutting out into the James River. That's the 1,500-acre patent that he would have applied. There was a powder magazine that was found there, and it looks like there was a wooden palisade that was around it, but more work needs to be done with that. In terms of what got done in New England, there is a fortification that is very close to an area where Daniel Gookin Jr. patented and ended up working with one of the Praying Town Indian communities that is almost identical to that footprint of the Nansemond Fort. It's rectangular with rounded off bastions on opposing corners. So there again, it's been 5 years since I did the dissertation research. I've waited for 5. I need to start publishing, and I want to do a little bit more. But I think there certainly are some more tangible links to think about with those fortifications that are known archaeologically.
And just a very quick follow-on question there, Luke. Like, you think that when they designed the fortification there in Massachusetts, or indeed the Nansemond fort down in Virginia, that they were having the Irish bonds in mind when they went about designing those fortifications in North America?
It seems likely, and there again, it's not just Gookin that you get; it's those other patentees, people like George White, people like John Parrott, people like the Newces. While we don't have archaeological evidence for them, they do obviously fortify for that 1622 attack. And then it seems likely that they could have been drawing on that kind of, collective vocabulary of what would have been seen in the Munster plantation landscape. And I know, as I said, it's not a one-to-one thing. I know that with scholarship, we've been, back and forth down this road, looking at Ulster plantations in North America as being the precedent for what you see on the ground. But I think when you get into the biographies of the people that come over here and settle and do persist, you can start to look at those parallels and make that connection.
Very good. Thanks, Luke, and good to talk to you.
Likewise, James. Good to talk to you too.
Breed McGrath, the question.
Yeah. Hi. So 2 absolutely fascinating papers. I can't comment on Luke's, although it was really, really interesting. I have a question for David, and then also a comment. So the question is, given that Newce had set up Bandon Bridge and was running it, how come Boyle is the person who gets it incorporated in 1612-13 and is very careful to write in to the charter all the things that he wants, like that it's on both sides of the river, that they have the right to guilds and fraternities, that he has the right to choose who is the chief officer from 3 people who are nominated for him by the town. If Newce is in charge, how come Boyle is doing this? And then the second item is just to add in a comment that Lot Peer, who was MP for Baltimore in 1634 and was one of Sir William Sillinger, the president of Munster's secretaries, was heavily involved in the Virginia Company at the same time as he was involved in Ireland. So I'm just sort of curious about his combined activities there and whether you have any comment on it. Thank you.
In relation to the second query, I don't have any further info on that. I mean, in relation to Bandon Bridge in 1612, 1613, Boyle, the short answer is that I don't really know. I mean, it's a very good question. I would suspect, is it leverage? Is it just that Newce isn't somebody who's able to leverage the government in order to actually get these kind of dispensations for Bandon Bridge, but that Boyle is?
Scraping the barrel for anybody who can incorporate a town. It's right. Sort of extraordinary that Boyle can do it when Newce can't.
It's a jurisdictional issue, because the thing is that he's there are various parts to the line. Some of it is in the Beecher signory, and some of it then is in the Grenville signory. So is it potentially that Newce and Archdeacon don't have a full lease of what Boyle is then subsequently able to get? Because I mean, it's very convoluted. There's about 6-7 years of transactions in the Lismore papers that it's not 100% clear as to when he actually gets outright possession of the town. It starts around 1612, and then eventually he doesn't acquire it outright until 1619. So maybe it has something to do with the vagaries of the actual possession. But I suppose in terms of the absolute reason why in 1612, 1613, I don't know.
Thank you.
David Gookin, you want to ask a question there? You need to turn on your mic, perhaps.
There we go. All right, now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering, I read several papers, including Luke's dissertation, that mentioned that Daniel's older brother, Vincent, had served as High Sheriff of County Cork during the 1620s. I'm not exactly sure what part of the decade he does, I'm just wondering if that has any influence on Daniel's activities in Cork and over in Newport.
Luke?
Yeah, I guess I can't really speak to that, as much, and maybe David has a little bit more to add, because the information that I found on Vincent Gookin Sr., because not to muddy the water, but there's also a Vincent Gookin Jr. Who persists in Cork for quite some time. The trail for Vincent Sr. really runs cold, other than it seems like he manages to make everybody upset, and it isn't a really great, likable figure. So I don't really know what that might have had to do with his relationship with his younger brother. I think where the relationship is strongest is that Vincent Sr. is the first member of the family to come over and settle from Kent, and he's followed by his younger brother, who perhaps he helps get set up. But I think that's as far as I can take it.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you for those questions. I think this debate will continue, and hopefully it will continue next year in Newport News itself. I now turn to our keynote speaker tonight, Professor Nicholas Connie. For nearly 50 years, Nicholas Connie has been making original contributions to Irish and Atlantic history now, and his contribution is immense. I suppose his most important books in relation to Irish history are his, he sets up the ideas of the Elizabethan conquest. In the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland, a pattern established where he talks about colonies and provincial presidencies as a way the Elizabethan conquest is going to proceed. In relation to this particular topic we're discussing today, also very important is his Upstart Earl, the study of the social and mental world of Richard Boyle, first Earl of Cork. And most recently, he has written a big overview of the whole period, Making Ireland British. Nicholas has also worked more widely on Atlantic history, particularly developing, I suppose, the work of David Quinn in Kingdom and Colony, a book of essays in honour of David Quinn, The Westward Enterprise, and other books like The Europeans on the Move, and then The Origins of Empire as well, another edited book about British overseas enterprise. More significantly, or equally significantly, Nicholas has contributed to the research environment in Ireland, starting in University College Galway itself, where he developed the Moore Institute, and also at the Royal Irish Academy. Nicholas has been a member of the European Research Council, and also concluded his career as president of the Royal Irish Academy and then winner of the Cunningham Medal. So Nicholas is no better man to conclude tonight's proceedings. So Nicholas, perhaps you can give us your reflections on what we've been discussing today. I can't hear. Nicholas? Nicholas, your microphone. Your microphone, Nicholas.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, loud enough?
A little louder, please, if you can.
Yeah, how do I put it up?
That's fine. I think that's fine. If you speak at that level, you're fine.
Okay, we'll stick with that. You'll have to give me a technological exercise. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's great to bring the two places that Gookin has been, to bring them together in this conference, and I congratulate you in doing that. And I might say that I learned quite a deal from listening to the papers I've heard this afternoon. except that what I'm doing is an overview, whereas what you have been doing are particular papers, and you are bringing forward new evidence, and I'm just offering some generalizations. That Gookin is to be commended, I think, for enterprise in that he recognized the possibility of exporting cattle to Virginia. Cattle being particularly important in Virginia because Virginia was a place of high mortality. It was a place where property lost its value very quickly. It was a place where people, if they had children at all, could expect that their children would be in infancy when they would die. And if they wanted to provide for their future, the likelihood was that they could provide for them in movable property rather than in land. Because once tobacco cultivation became the normal mode of economic activity, land exhaustion became pretty normal. So that if you were talking about 15 years before a child reached their maturity, the land wasn't going to be worth much at all. So that people had a strategy of giving movable wealth, and particularly livestock. Livestock and their natural produce were given in wills in order to provide for the welfare of children. So that Gookin had recognized that possibility. What Gookin was doing, to some degree, is fairly typical of the type of intercolonial connections that develop everywhere in the 17th century and that persist through the 18th century. That people who of any nationality who become involved in colonial enterprise look for opportunity in place A, but if they're not doing as well as they might, then they look to see for opportunity elsewhere, or indeed they become involved in two or more locations and develop trading connections between them with a view to advancing themselves economically. So that in that sense, Gookin is to some degree fairly typical, or he can be taken as a typical of an enterprising entrepreneur involved in colonial activity. Where does Ireland come into the picture? That Ireland, quite clearly from what you have been saying, was a colony, or at least the Munster that you've been talking about was being colonized heavily during the first half of the 17th century. And a major colonial enterprise was underway in the plantation of Ulster and in other parts of the country happening at the same time. So that in that sense, the scale of operation that was happening in Ireland was in a much greater scale than anything that was happening on the other side of the Atlantic at the same time. So that Ireland in that sense is a site for imperial expansion. But it was also a base from which colonial expansion was launched to other places. Because as we saw in the case of Gookin, some people who went into Ireland saw an opportunity of developing, moving from there and developing their interests elsewhere. But it was not only a place where colonists from England, in this case, or from Scotland, moved elsewhere and used Ireland as a kind of a launching pad. That Irish people, that is indigenous Irish people, also engaged in colonial enterprise. So that in that sense, those who were being colonized within Ireland, that at the same time, they were becoming, developing colonial activity themselves. And that's one of the peculiarities of the Irish situation. And the other is the fact that Ireland, the very people who were developing Ireland as a colony or establishing themselves as colonial entrepreneurs in Ireland, were at the same time given responsibility for developing Ireland as a kingdom, which is not a factor in any of the other colonies that we're talking about. Another peculiarity of the Irish situation is that the indigenous Irish population not only engaged themselves in British colonial enterprise, but many of them became involved in colonial activity of other European powers, and we'll return to that at a later stage. So that the points that I will be dealing with is that there was divided opinion in Ireland on the morality of colonization generally, in the sense that most of the indigenous population in Ireland objected to themselves becoming the subject of colonial activity and being exploited. But at the same time, they didn't have any great objections to becoming involved in colonial enterprise themselves. Another matter that we'll come to is local and global, because in all colonial activity, to some degree, the beneficiaries of colonization like to return home to show off how well they have done by enterprising further away from home. And that will address the question of the extent to which Ireland was a stimulus for British expansion, or whether Ireland was an inhibitor to British activity elsewhere. So before we come to these general points, I think it's important to recognize that Ireland was fairly late in the game when it came to becoming engaged in overseas activity. If you compare Ireland with Portugal, for example, both relatively small countries, both relatively poor countries, that Portugal becomes involved in colonial activity almost earlier than any other country in Europe, and that it becomes so important to Portugal that the colonial activity is probably by the 17th century more important than any activity that's happening within the Kingdom of Portugal itself. Ireland, on the other hand, relatively few Irish people have much interest in the world outside the island of Ireland itself. Now, that is not to say that Ireland is without outside contact. There were trading contacts from the east, the ports on the east coast of Ireland with Britain, and there were trading contacts from the ports on the south and west, moving to the western coast of France and the western coast of Spain, looking for mineral wealth and for salt and for wine. So that in that sense, there were outside contacts. People from the Basque country particularly came to Ireland on an annual basis to ship off the shores of Ireland, and they landed in order to dry their catches, and that there was therefore some interaction between the local coastal populations and these fishermen who came from overseas. And as Bernadette Cunningham has shown in a recent book, there were a significant number of Irish people who went in pilgrimage, and most of this pilgrimage activity, particularly to Spain, was facilitated by the fact that there was this regular movement of ships between Spain and Ireland, associated principally with shipping activity. Another factor which gives an increased external activity was the fact that as England, which was the dominant political power over Ireland as the 16th century progresses, as England becomes Protestant, the populations in Ireland for the most part remain Catholic. And as a consequence of that, if they see themselves persecuted for religion, or if they engage in resistance to English incursion in the country, that it is to Catholic powers in continental Europe that they look for support. And as we say, a point to this limited contact, that even when it comes to overseas expansion, to some degree, Irish people seem to have had some knowledge of what is taking place. There's a reference to somebody from Galway who accompanied Henry the Navigator in some of his exploits and was rewarded with a gift of a lion, which he brings back to his home city, so that Galway had the beginning of a zoological garden, so to speak. And we know more definitely that Christopher Columbus stopped in Galway, as he mentions in his diary, in 1477. At that point, it is likely that Columbus was voyaging from Portugal to Iceland and stopped off in Galway as a stopping port on the way there. So that when it comes to the point of seeking refuge on the continent, and to some degree linking the local and the global, and coming back to what Hiram was saying, that there is an interesting reference in a pamphlet which Raleigh was responsible for, relating to the sinking of the Revenge, which was the ship of Sir Richard Grenville, which, as Hiram pointed out, had been mayor of Cork in the 1570s, I think it was. And Grenville and Raleigh were both involved in the war in Munster, and Raleigh was one of the major, the principal acquirer of estates in the Munster plantation, the estates which afterwards go into the hands of Richard Boyle. But Raleigh himself doesn't develop the land he acquires in Munster. He becomes involved in Atlantic enterprise. neither does Grenville persist in Ireland, that he again becomes involved in exploitation in other parts of the Atlantic. And that one of the activities that he engages upon is attempting to seize the Spanish silver fleet on its return from the New World to Spain. This was a kind of an ongoing activity for these piratical English sailors, and they traditionally did so by skulking around the Azores and watching for their opportunity of seizing on a vessel. And this is what Grenville was involved in 1591. Except that on this occasion, there is a particularly good convoy protecting the silver fleet, and that Grenville engages in a battle, and the pamphlet is essentially about this sea battle itself, where Grenville is killed and the Revenge is sunk. But in the description, Raleigh mentions the fact that the principal or the fiercest soldiers on board the Spanish vessel which sinks them were Fitzgeralds from Munster, who had lost their lands and who would have known Grenville, and therefore that they would have a particular revenge to take in this conflict. And he also mentions that after some of the survivors had been taken prisoners, that the most spiteful of their captors were the Irish, who engaged in conversation with them, not only lauding the triumph they had had over them, but attempting to persuade them to abandon their religion and to revert to Catholicism. So that's an interesting anecdote, if you like, which shows the extent to which Ireland was becoming involved in colonial activity in other empires, as well as in the British Empire itself. Now, coming back to my own writing on the subject, one of the first pieces I ever published was in the William and Mary Quarterly, which was published not far from Newport News, although I'm disappointed to find it wasn't called after the Newce family. But in that paper, The Ideology of English Colonization from Ireland to America, which has been anthologized and which is regularly referred to, although quite clearly I wouldn't, having written it and published it in 1971, if I were to redo it today, it would be a very different paper. But what the differences would be is that, first of all, I wouldn't emphasize as much the from Ireland to America side of things, in that I think what we're talking about in that paper are the development of parallels between colonial activity in Ireland and in the Americas, rather than a necessary influence of one upon the other. The second factor is that the people that I identified as apologist for colonization in that particular paper, I don't think I would now, or I can now recognize there was little originality in what they were saying, in that effectively what was being written in the various pamphlets that were published in Ireland in the 16th and by English people about Ireland in the 16th and into the 17th century were really updates of what had been written by Gerald of Wales or Geraldus Cambrensis in the 12th century. In that sense, I don't think in that paper I mentioned Gerald of Wales at all, whereas now I certainly would mention him, not only because the people who were writing about Ireland in the 16th and 17th century were familiar with that text and were updating it effectively to present circumstances, but also because Gerald of Wales was read extensively in continental Europe, and that his arguments in favor of colonization were arguments which were adopted by European powers. So that we find that when Spain addresses the moral problems associated with colonization and sets up a series of committees to look into the problem and to arrive at conclusions in the body of scholarship that's known as the work of the Salamanca School, that one of the justifiers for colonization, or some of the arguments, were those of Gerald of Wales, and that what the conclusions that the Salamanca School arrived at were adopted and became extensively known in England, so that when English people seek to justify colonization in the 17th century, they're drawing upon what has been argued in Spain some decades previously, but in doing so are effectively drawing also upon what Gerald of Wales had said many centuries before. And another issue that anybody talking about from influence from one place to another is that everybody who sets about establishing colonies believes that they are in the business of creating an ideal society. And in many of these cases, and including in the Munster plantation, you get diagrams of what this model society is to be like. And that it invariably is going to be hierarchical. As a consequence of the hierarchy, it's going to be a differential society in that the lord who's in charge is going to populate his settlement with people who are going to show deference to him. It is going to be an industrious society because he's going to bring in people who have a wide range of skills, who are going to be able to exploit the resources of the area to be colonized more effectively than the indigenous population had done so previously. And it is going to be a pious society. And the church is always a prominent position in these models which are devised. But at the same time, while people worked in models, and to some degree the models which they devised drew upon their own experiences in England itself, or drew upon biblical information, at the same time they recognized that in their home situations that certain restraints limited their activity, and they believed that in setting up new settlements that these restraints to some degree could be cast aside. So when we look at the literature that the late Joan Thirsk published about what she called as alternative agriculture, when various promoters of manufacturing adventures in England recognized the possibility of import substitution by growing commodities on which England had to import abroad. And when they sought to produce new crops from which they could make canvas, for example, or dye stuffs, that they encountered problems in establishing and in finding land in which to have these grown in their home communities. So when they go into colonial activity, that this is provides them with an opportunity of doing so. So that you find in Ireland that various experiments are made at producing these various dye stuffs. Similarly in Virginia, the expectation is that this is an area climatically where silk is going to be produced. In the heel of the hunt, it is tobacco that becomes a commercial product, and the production of tobacco, as it happens, becomes the dominant activity. And this is not an import substitute at all. It is the creation of a commodity which had not been known by European peoples at all previously, but for which a market is found. But nonetheless, this experimentation with crops becomes part and parcel of all colonial activity. And this is happening in Ireland as it happens in Virginia, even though in the Irish situation, ultimately the primary wealth resource continues as it always had been. Livestock production is that which could be conducted most successfully. But as well as that, there is a common assumption in all colonial activity that the incoming colonizers are a more expert people than those who they are displacing, and that the previous population had not been making adequate use of the resources which God had provided them with. In fact, this is one of the principal rationalizations and justifications for colonization in the first instance. But as well as the fact that they weren't making adequate use of the agricultural resources and the byproducts which would come from those, it was also presupposed that they weren't active discoverers of mineral wealth. So therefore, in every colonial site, ventures are made to discover mineral wealth, and particularly after the discovery of precious metals by the Spaniards in the New World, that it is believed that there are precious metals to be discovered everywhere if you have the expertise to go about finding them. And that if you don't find precious metals, at least you might find coal or iron, and therefore mineral discovery becomes one of the activities associated with all colonial sites. And that in the case of Ireland, it's not only that they are seeking out mineral wealth, they are also using the natural resources of the country, particularly the plentiful timber supplies, in order to facilitate the smelting of iron ore, which could only be done effectively by having access to plentiful timber from which you could make charcoal. And of course, the timber is also being exploited for the making of barrel staves. On the American side, they do contemplate the same activity, and later than the period you're talking about, iron smelting is established in many of the areas in eastern, what is the United States today. But in the earlier term, the recognition was the possibility of having ship masts, because there were taller trees available in the Americas than were available in Britain itself, and that these were altogether of a better purpose for ship masts than anything that could be found, at least at home, and they would have had to go to Scandinavia. So in that degree, there is an import substitution taking place. And in all colonial sites, there is a vague sense of evangelization, which some individuals take more seriously than others, as we saw in the case of one of the Gookins. Now that Ireland is an inhibitor, this was a point that I came to principally when I did the Oxford History of the British Empire, the first volume that Hiram referred to, in the paper that I wrote there. I was referring to the fact that while much has been made of Ireland as a stepping stone towards colonization elsewhere, the fact that the English and the Scots became involved in Ireland, it to some degree placed a brake upon their activity in other parts of the world. First of all, because of the large human input. The colonization can only take place if you have people to send out from the home country to establish colonies abroad, and that Ireland becomes the great absorber of people. That over the course of the full course of the 17th century, I have calculated that something like 200,000 people migrated from Britain into Ireland. I say Britain because I'm talking now about the Scottish migration as well as the English migration. And that's probably a larger number of people that moved to any other British overseas destination at the same time. Now, the total number of people who moved to all colonies in the Americas is greater than that, but that number is not reached in any one location. So that in that sense, the fact that Ireland was drawing so many people was placing a brake on the number of people who were available for colonial activity in other locations that Britain was engaged upon. And I think this is particularly true of Scots. The Scots, generally speaking, are not seriously involved in transatlantic colonial activity other than in Nova Scotia, previous to the close of the 17th century or the early years of the 18th century. The 18th century becomes the great century of Scottish colonial activity. That previous to then, the destinations the Scots went to were into the Baltic, which brought them as far afield as Poland, but also brought them as soldiers into the armies of the competing Protestant powers in Northern Europe, particularly the armies of Sweden and Denmark. But then they moved into Ulster. That Ulster becomes probably the biggest location outside Scotland where Scottish people can establish themselves through the full course of the 17th century, interrupted in the middle years of the 17th century by conflict in Ireland, but it picks up very rapidly after the 1660s, and the biggest migration of all from Scotland into Ireland occurs in the 1690s. So that I would suggest that the fact that so many Scots were going into Ireland, that they were finding opportunity there, explains why there are such a limited number of Scots involved in colonial activity elsewhere. As far as the English were concerned, that England was a more populous country, but nonetheless Ireland acted and there were lots of English people going into Virginia and into the West Indies, particularly in the island of Barbados in the 17th century. But these, for the most part, were unskilled people, and there was great difficulty in finding women migrants to accompany the men who went to these destinations, so that in that sense they had difficulty in reproducing themselves through natural growth. Because Ireland was attracting a much more diversified and highly skilled population, and Ireland was also attracting a great number of women settlers. So that in that sense, Ireland is attracting the type of settler which the people who devised the models of colonial settlement believed were the ideal type which should be going to any colonial situation. So that in that sense, Ireland was proving more attractive to this desirable type of settler because it had opportunity, because it is its proximity, and because quite clearly there was a visible social advancement. That when people look at possible destinations, or at least when they did so in the 17th century, they didn't have any statistician to say what statistically your chances were. They looked at the few people who had done spectacularly well, people like Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork, and that would probably be the greatest advertising factor in favour of going to Ireland rather than going to any other destination. A person from very impecunious means who becomes one of the wealthiest subjects of King Charles I in a 30-year period. If time allows, are we doing okay for time? I'm talking of the issue of Ireland and a variety of empires. Again, one of the peculiarities of the Irish situation. And that we saw that Irish people, Irish Catholics, as well as the settler population, become involved in British overseas empires. That almost at the same time that we're talking about Gookin's activities, there were Irish people from the estuary of the River Shannon who were involved in colonial activity in the area of the Amazon. How they went there, why they went there, rather than anywhere else, we're not quite sure of. I think myself it is because there were some Dutch people settled by the O'Briens of Thomond on their estates, and these might have been the people who would have pointed the direction in going to the Amazon as a place where you might make your fortune. There were again Irish Catholics, Irish Catholic merchants who sponsored colonial activities in the West Indies, particularly on the island of Montserrat, and that they continued in that activity on a voluntary basis through the 17th century and also into Barbados. And then, of course, there was the involuntary Irish movement to the West Indies, which was associated with the military success of Oliver Cromwell, who effectively sends thousands of Irish as indentured servants onto the island of Barbados as well. But then again, looking at the British, particularly the British Atlantic settlement, you find from the later 17th century forward that there is a significant voluntary Irish migration, initially Protestant with some Catholics, but then over time, as you move into the early 18th century, more evenly balanced between Protestant and Catholic, and at the end of the 18th century, more Catholic than Protestant, of Irish people moving to the mainland of North America, particularly to the central colonies, the colonies from Pennsylvania southwards down to Maryland. So that in that sense, there is Irish people see opportunity in British colonial endeavour, now focusing on the mainland of British North America rather than on the West Indies, where the labour force was being provided by a slave population at this time. But at the same time, there was a significant out-migration of Irish people to continental Europe, because when Irish people were defeated in war, they almost invade the survivors, almost invariably found refuge in Catholic countries in continental Europe. Spain in the end of the 16th century and through the first half of the 17th century, in France from the later part of the 17th century forward. That the larger number of people who go are soldiers with their officers, but as well as that, a significant number of people who are priests or who were would-be seminarians, and that there are a series of colleges established in the Catholic countries of Western Europe to provide for the education of these people. And then in the third category of out migrants would have been merchants, at the point when towns were disturbed by the influx of English invaders, particularly in Cromwellian times. Merchants, for the most part, established themselves at the point of exile in whatever ports and continental Europe they had had some trading contacts previously. But you find with the passage of time that they increasingly gravitate towards Atlantic ports that are involved with colonization activity in the Americas. So that you find in the case, you find Irish merchant communities emerging in Cadiz, in Nantes, in Bordeaux, and they are looking outwards towards the Atlantic. And as a consequence of these activities, that some elements of all three migrant types, soldiers, clergy, merchants, some of these make their way into the colonies of the powers that have hosted them. The work that has been done by Igor Perez Tostado and Oscar Recio Morales shows that in the case of Spain, that Irish people, particularly Irish people who migrated as soldiers, did relatively well compared to other European groups, because there was, from an early stage, a special Irish regiment established in the Low Countries for Irish soldiers with their own officers. But there was still a limit beyond a glass ceiling beyond which somebody couldn't move in a society where there was a limited number of patronage. And those who wanted to do better, who wanted to break through this glass ceiling, could volunteer for service in the colonies, particularly in the Spanish West Indies, which were being established as a kind of a protection area for the activity that was happening on the mainland, so that they wanted to establish the Caribbean as a type of a Spanish lake and to prevent other European intruders from becoming involved in that area. So there's a significant number of Irish people become employed as soldiers and as officers, and if they survive the hazards of the disease environment, they were assured of a more rapid promotion in the ranks than if they had remained in European theatres of war. And some of them succeed in moving from there onto activity on the mainland of America, which was a more desirable place in which to be involved. We know in this, when we talk about Irish people going into the Americas, quite clearly a significant number of the clergy who went from Ireland were trained in the seminaries in continental Europe and were ordained. Some of them do return to Ireland, but over time the vast majority make their careers in the host countries, and the host countries send many of these Irish clergy to their colonies, so that in that sense clergy were become a part and parcel, Irish clergy become part and parcel of Spanish and French colonial activity. But the merchants, as I said, also established themselves in the towns, the port towns, which are looking outwards onto the Atlantic. And as a consequence of this, you find significant Irish merchant communities becoming involved in slave trading, in sugar production, and they make their appearance in the islands of almost every European nationality in the West Indies as the 18th century proceeds. In that sense, this is an unusual phenomenon, that the Irish are a kind of a multi-empire group. They are involved in British colonial activity, they are involved in Spanish colonial activity, they're involved in French colonial activity, and they're also involved in piratical activity, which brings to some degree all of these three together. Because to some degree, these Irish emigrant groups remain in contact with each other and remain in contact also with their country of origin. And here I want to come to the point which I said of relating local and global. That those who have gone into colonial activity are, we might describe as global people. But global people, particularly people who move into unhealthy environments, such as West Africa or the West Indies, that if you look at, for example, the Scots in the 18th century, because the Scots become heavily involved in both areas from the early 18th century forward, the Scots who make a good in these areas, well, first of all, while they are involved in dangerous environments, and if they have European wives with them and some children, after children are born, they tend to send their wives home and provide for them at a distance, recognizing that this is a hazardous environment for them to continue to live in. But as well as that, if they make good, their ambition is to return to the home country. So they do return, and that they purchase land or houses or become involved in merchant activity at all, investing the profits they have made in their hazardous environment, investing them at home and having a higher social status than would have been available to them had they never gone away at all. This opportunity is available to Irish Protestants, that Irish Protestant families who become involved in colonial activity, many of them do return and invest their profits in the development of their estates and of their houses. But it is not an opportunity that is available to Irish Catholics because they're not allowed to purchase property at home. So that insofar as they maintain a European involvement, it is by sending their children to schools, to Catholic schools, which have been established in the Low Countries or in France, and that these schools act as a kind of a linkage between Irish people who have been involved in merchant activity, military activity, or Irish Catholics who have remained at home, or in the case of some Irish Catholics who have done well in mainland British America, that they too would send their children to be educated in these Catholic schools. So this acts as a kind of a linkage. As well as that, linkage is maintained with their places of origin, because while Irish people who leave effectively leave permanently, relatively few return other than priests. Who return for parish activity at home. But other than that, migration for Irish people is a permanent migration. But while they have left permanently, nonetheless, those who are involved as officers in the army, for example, whether it's in the Spanish army or in the French army, that involvement in an army is beneficial only as long as you have recruits to fill your ranks. So that in that sense, they had of necessity to maintain contact with their places, their home places, in order to provide soldiers in the ranks, but also they were providing benefit to their families by bringing younger sons of families to be trained as officers, and therefore providing a respectable career for younger sons of the small number of Catholic families who continued to remain in possession of land as you proceed into the 18th century. And it's the same with priests. Priests, by definition, want to have other seminarians attending the seminaries that they themselves attended. So it's a consequence of that, that the seminaries, that the various Irish colleges that are established established throughout Europe continue to recruit seminarians in Ireland, providing a continuing out-migration. And that this contact is very much a local contact, that priests who go abroad, remain abroad, recruit seminarians from their localities from which they had come themselves, and sometimes family members. And also with merchant families, that merchant families also provide opportunities for younger sons of the families that they have left behind at home, providing them with opportunities and indeed providing linkages between the trading activity that they are engaged upon and whatever trade the original family has continued to be involved with at home. Something we should also mention is the fact that those who are involved in trade also, regardless of what location they're in or in which under which jurisdiction they're working, they see it in their interest to engage to some degree in London, because London is a major financial centre. And if they want to engage in continuing activity, expanding their activity, that is in London itself. So in that sense, despite the fact that they are prohibited from advancing themselves in Ireland because of the penal laws, that they still can progress successfully and become involved in the economic activity of London, regardless of religious prohibition. I think we have covered most of the points now, which brings me back to my concluding point, is that the issue of the morality of colonization itself. That it is the colonial powers that provide the rationale that justified colonization, and the victims of the people who object to it and say that it is immoral. In the Irish situation, unquestionably, the immorality of colonization is articulated by those who are opposed to Ireland becoming a site for colonization, but at the same time, Irish people are active in colonial activity in different spheres themselves. And that this difference of opinion, it persists into the 19th century, and we can conclude in the 19th century that there is a strong tradition in Irish nationalism as it develops in the 19th century of opposition to empire. You find that perhaps the most strident opponent of empire is John Mitchell. From his various earliest writings, he doesn't say he's anti-English, he doesn't say he's anti-British, but he's anti-empire. But nonetheless, when Mitchell himself, so he sees himself as being a victim of empire within Ireland itself. But then when he's taken prisoner and is brought as a prisoner to Van Diemen's Land, he gives a very graphic description of the various imperial points that he passes through, but he also sees himself as being a victim of empire. And after he escapes from Van Diemen's Land and gets himself to America, again he persists in being opposed to empire and all of the evils associated with it. But nonetheless, this does not, in the American context, prevent him in any way from becoming sympathetic towards the Confederacy and towards the slave-owning states in America, and becoming an apologist for slavery as well as an apologist for the Confederates during the Civil War. And similarly, if we move to the later 19th century, much is said of the extent to which Irish nationalists identified with the Boers in the war which was being fought in South Africa, and saw supporting the Boers as a means of opposing British Empire. But in supporting the Boers, they were supporting a people who were greater exploiters of African population than were those who were opposing. So in that sense, there is this dichotomy in the Irish mind over the issue of empire. But that extends also over into clergy. That we saw that Irish priests were involved in colonial activity in the employ of Spain and of Portugal. So that to some degree, you could say they're on the side of the colonists rather than the victims of colonization. But as you proceed into the 19th century, and as the British Empire expands beyond what anybody could have anticipated in the 19th century, that particularly middle-class Irish Catholics see a career opportunity in empire. But the Catholic clergy also see empire as an opportunity to evangelize parts of the world where they would not have been involved in before. So they draw a parallel between the British Empire and the Empire of Ancient Rome. The Empire of Ancient Rome had provided early Christians with an opportunity of Christianizing the world, and in the same way they believed that the British Empire of the 19th century is providing them with an opportunity not only of sending missionaries abroad to sustain the faith among the Irish population who had made careers in the British Empire, but with a view to evangelizing the world at large. So that in that sense, there's an ambiguity which has been there from the outset and which persists to the 19th century. So that's it, Hiram.
Thank you, Nicholas. That's very extensive. I'm sure there must be some questions that people will want to ask.
We have very little time. We have very little time, I think. Go ahead, I'll take questions. And how do I answer, or how do I will hear the question, is it, and you'll hear me answering, is that it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Some questions, please.
Tom Hearn.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Nicholas. That was,
Hello, Tom.
yeah, that was terrific. Great to hear your voice and see you.
Yeah.
Question
I can't see you though.
Yeah, I know. My camera's broken on my laptop, believe it or not. And that's just as well. It's a favor to you, believe me. So the question I have is, you did say, getting back to Sir Walter Raleigh, that he did not have much of a impact as a colonist, or wasn't much of a property manager or owner, something like that. But he, among the Munster colonists, he was one of the people who actually went and oversaw his estates and seemed to make a real effort at bringing people in and developing the iron and all of that. I know he left, was already thinking of leaving by the mid-1590s, but would you reconsider that question of what impact Raleigh himself had as a colonist in Ireland?
He has an impact in the sense that he acquires a very large block of land, but I think the biggest impact he has is that he sells that for £1,000 to Richard Boyle, and Richard Boyle develops. But yes, he had brought Pine and other people in as, but he doesn't stay on the ground to develop what he might have done. You know, he wants to become involved in politics in England. He wants to be involved in Atlantic activity, so he doesn't stay on the ground to develop what he had acquired. You know, he's a bit of a quick move. I mean, to some degree, staying in Ireland provincialized you. If you were an English person with a courtier like Raleigh, if he had stayed on the estate and developed it as Boyle does in the 17th century, he would have been provincializing himself, and that he sees himself as a courtier. So that yes, he does want to acquire the land. He does want to bring in a certain number of tenants who are going to develop the land for him, but he's not going to supervise their activity.
Thank you.
And Nicholas, what do you think of, you know, it's persistently made a comparison of the Irish with the Indians, and particularly, you know, when you started out, maybe you were actually contradicting your earlier notions there, you know, with the Elizabethan conquest, the pattern established in the William and Mary article.
Yeah. I have a nice little quote, but I can't find it now. But you see, pamphleteers were writing about Ireland and about the Indians at the same time. That's because right. The Indians were new at the time, and sometimes people are writing about both. and they were getting bits and pieces of information about one when they were writing about the other. So that in that sense, in their literature, they invariably, or they very frequently draw on the experiences of one in order to denigrate the other, so to speak. But they were two very different peoples. One of my regrets of having written that paper is that sometimes when I go to America, that people said that you said in 1971 that the Irish were the same as American Indians, which is not something that I ever said at all. It is that English people said that Irish people and the American Indians were at the same stage of development. And they certainly did say that. And the quotation I had was one which I had on a piece of paper here, it must have fallen to the ground. It was from Sir John Davies. When he's, I found it, when he's addressing the question of why the English are justified in establishing plantations in Ireland. They are justified in doing so because there has been a conquest, and because, taking the precedent of ancient Rome, the conqueror is entitled to have a conquest. That's one line of argument that he has. But he also argues it on the grounds of improving the God-given resources, that Irish people weren't developing these as they might have done, and that they weren't doing so because within the Irish landholding system, as he describes it, this will be coming back to his case on the law of tanistry, that the Irish don't have possessive individualism, and that a society can only become wealthy where people have a certainty of holding their land without intrusion from some other people. And in order to make his case, he says, imagine if we, that is the English, were a poor and naked people, as many natives in America be. We would easily agree to be judged by the next man we meet, and so make short end at every controversy. So that in that sense, when he wants to make a parallel, a comparison to justify his argument, that he takes it for granted that everybody accepts that the Native American populations don't have individual ownership of land, and therefore they're going around killing each other every day. But again, he's now making the point that because in Ireland, because of portable inheritance, and because of the law of tanistry, that you don't have individual ownership of land, and therefore the same happens there. So that's the comparison which he immediately draws when he wants to make his point. That satisfy you?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah. So, anybody else? Any other questions?
Yeah, I might come in, Hiram, very quickly.
Yeah,
you mentioned about Gerald of Wales, Nicholas. So I was just wondering, in terms of there are very few contemporary reference. I mean, I don't dispute your contention that their political, their colonial and ideological perception of the Irish was probably framed by Gerald.
Yeah.
But there are very few contemporary references to Gerald specifically by people who write about Ireland in the 16th century. And now, do you think that is because they're unaware of the fact that they're deriving some of their ideas from Gerald secondhand, or did they just don't reference them?
What's its name? Yeah, they don't reference them. They're very well aware of them because Gerald of Wales was reprinted in not Hackcliffe, but in
Holinshed.
Holinshed, and then both in the 1577 and the 1587 editions of Holinshed, there are different sections of Gerald of Wales in each of them, and almost every person who is reading in the English language would certainly have read the 1587 text. The 1577 text is the Irish book wasn't published with the full set of Holinshed. There was a legal problem about publishing the Irish book because of what was said about I think the Earl of Ormond objected to how the Kildares were being represented in the rebellion of the 1530s. But the 1587 text was certainly read by it's probably the most widely read book other than the Bible in the end of the 16th century.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Chad Ludington, do you want to ask a question?
Get to unmute. Hi, Nicholas. How are you? It's been a long time.
Chad, haven't met you for a long time.
I just wanted to offer up the possibility of Bordeaux being a slightly different type of community. I'm working on a book on the Irish community in Bordeaux, and I think one of the things that might make them stand slightly outside the pattern that very clearly does exist is that most of their trade was actually directed back toward Ireland itself, in as much as,
right, yeah.
I mean, the merchants were certainly importing salt beef in particular, but then they weren't directly involved with provisioning the islands. Most of that was sold to French merchants, many of them in this case what the French called Jewish or Portuguese merchants who were Sephardic Jews living in Bordeaux.
Yeah.
So they were indirectly involved in that trade, but their big trade was actually back to the island of Ireland in the form of wine and, of course, the barrels, which were then purchased by whiskey makers in Ireland. So I'm just the possibility that maybe that community stood slightly outside of the patterns that exist in places like Nantes, where you do see a huge amount of involvement in the slave trade among Irish who settled there. So it's maybe Bordeaux is an exception to the rule.
No, my answer to that would be that Bordeaux is a later development. That Bordeaux, to some degree, is a kind of a satellite development of what had been happening in Nantes previously. Nantes is an earlier settlement, and they're involved very heavily in transatlantic activity there and in slave trading. The Walshes in Nantes are one of the biggest slave traders in the port of Nantes. Once they move to Bordeaux, they have kind of moved up in the world, and they begin to buy land a bit, and they become involved in wine production themselves. So that you're talking about a more sophisticated community. But yes, I didn't mention much about trading with Ireland itself, but once the provisioning trade becomes important in the 18th century, that Irish merchants abroad become heavily involved in the provisioning trade, but are using Ireland as a base from which to get provisions. So the Cork comes back into the picture there again, because you can get the loan of money in London, and you can get the provisions in Cork, and you can set out your ships from wherever country you happen to be in order to provide provisions for the slave population in the islands of that particular country.
Yeah.
No, so that you're talking about the development of a second level, a more sophisticated type of trade and these Irish families in Bordeaux have, to a large degree, intermarried with families in Bordeaux, but maintain contact with their relatives in the home country as well.
Oh yeah, no, that's very true. Well, thank you. Good to see you, by the way. Thank you for that presentation. And Hiram, thank you.
I can't see you. Yeah.
And thank you, Nicholas. I think we'll conclude the questions there. And
okay, thank you.
Thank you for that magnificent presentation. And the coverage was, as you say, global and as well as local. And I'd like to thank all the speakers. I think each of the papers in all the different facets were brilliant, and the questions as well were hugely informative. David Heffernan, have you got anything there to say to conclude?
Just to thank everybody that presented, and thanks as well everybody for attending. I don't really have much more than that. Just yeah, obviously.
Thank you, David, for organising all this and keeping it all together. And I'd like to wish everybody on the other side of the Atlantic a great Thanksgiving next weekend, and hopefully when this present pandemic is over, we'll see you in person at the other side of the Atlantic for Gookin's arrival there next year. Thank you all, and good luck.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Another copy of anything? Huh? Pennsylvania.